It is now around 10:20 a.m. in Japan, the beginning of day 5 in what has been one of the worst natural disasters in modern history. This is typically still the search and rescue phase of a disaster like this, and at this hour, the rescue mission does continue in Japan. But at this point, day 5 of this disaster, it appears to be more of a recovery mission rather than one of further dramatic rescues. Japanese troops, firemen, and police have all been mobilized to work in the rescue effort. And, of course, rescue crews from other countries, including the United States, are now on the ground in Japan assisting in this effort. But the sad reality of this disaster is that there do not appear to be many survivors to find. The vast majority of victims appear to have been killed by the earthquake and tsunami rather than injured by it. Further complicating the rescue effort are the enormous aftershocks that continue to come, one after the other. A search and rescue mission in the town of Soma had to be called off today after a magnitude 6.2 aftershock struck the area. The Japanese coast had been hit by more than 150 aftershocks since the initial earthquake struck on Friday. The immediate needs on the ground right now are really the basics of human existence: food, water, shelter. And while Japanese troops are handing out things like blankets and bottles of water, local officials report that only about 10% of the supplies needed have made it through to the affected areas so far. Those who managed to survive the initial disaster on Friday are not only in desperate need of the basics, but of course there is another concern brewing right now. Scenes like this are becoming increasingly frequent throughout the Japanese countryside. Hazmat teams testing earthquake survivors for radiation exposure. About 180,000 survivors have been evacuated from the areas surrounding the country's damaged nuclear reactors, and the possibility of radiation sickness is now among the concerns. The effect of radiation exposure in humans is something that you can be precise about. There are a wide range of outcomes that prolonged or, in some cases, even brief exposure to radiation can lead to. At the very worst end are examples like the Chernobyl nuclear reactor accident in 1986. 28 firefighters and plant workers who were exposed to large amounts of radiation in the immediate aftermath of that accident ultimately died of acute radiation sickness, mostly within just 3 weeks of being exposed. And that's sort of the key to understanding this. Radiation sickness is extremely rare, of course, but the greater your exposure to the radiation, both in terms of proximity and time, the more severe and the more immediate the symptoms are. So far in Japan, we have preliminary reports of several nuclear plant workers who have been treated for possible radiation exposure or sickness. Today, we got news that radiation exposure was detected in 17 members of the U.S. Navy who were conducting a relief mission in Japan. According to the Navy, the crew was exposed to the equivalent of 1 month's worth of natural background radiation. How serious is that? Well, it's serious enough that the Navy is telling us about it, but the treatment for it, the way they were decontaminated, was simply through using soap and water. This disaster in Japan is, of course, still ongoing. But one of the ways the Japanese government is trying to avoid nuclear meltdown at those reactors is by periodically releasing steam into the atmosphere at those reactors, steam that is radioactively contaminated. Right now, officials say that these radioactive releases do not pose a major health risk. But if they continue doing this, does it have a cumulative effect? Japanese officials estimate right now that about 190 people have been exposed at some level to some radiation from that nuclear plant within the last 4 days. Should we expect that number to go up? And what are the potential long-term effects here? Joining us now is David Brenner. He's the director of the Center for Radiological Research at Columbia University Medical Center. Mr. Brenner, thanks very much for being here. Appreciate it.
Pleasure to be here.
Did I get anything wrong there?
I think you had it exactly right.
I keep saying these really bad news things leading into people who know better, and I keep hoping I'm going to get it wrong. The two radioactive isotopes we've been hearing the most about in terms of what's been detected, what is worrying to Japanese authorities, are iodine-131 and cesium-137. Can you tell us anything about what to worry about with those particular elements, and are there others that you're concerned that people might be being exposed to?
Well, in fact, the population are being exposed to a whole panoply of different radioisotopes. Those are the two most common ones that you mentioned, iodine and cesium. But there is strontium, which is a bone seeker, so that goes to the bone. There's xenon. There are literally dozens of other ones. But cesium is probably the one that we should be most concerned about at the moment.
Why is that?
Because of its chemical nature, that it exposes the whole body. Iodine really only exposes the thyroid gland. Strontium is a bone seeker, so it only exposes the bone. Cesium exposes the whole body, so there is more concern about cesium.
In terms of what you know so far about this radioactive steam release and the evacuation area and the number of people exposed so far, do you expect that this is going to be an event that affects a very geographically large number of people in terms of medically important radioactive exposure? Or is this something that's likely to be confined to people in the very immediate area around the reactors?
Well, let's talk about two different populations. There is actually the population inside the nuclear reactor, the folks who are actually working, as you were describing before, to try and pour water into the core and try and keep the cores cool. Now, I think there's a significant possibility that some of them are going to be significantly exposed to radiation, to high doses, and it's certainly possible to lethal doses of radiation. We can contrast that with the general population outside the nuclear plant, and as you say, they've actually been evacuated for a few miles away. So now we've got a very large population exposed, at least as far as we know now, to pretty low doses of radiation. We'll know better in the next couple of days whether that dose of radiation becomes higher. But all in all, it is still going to be a low dose of radiation. The general population not going to be exposed to high levels of the sort that the nuclear workers are. So there are going to be different consequences for these two different populations.
In terms of the broader population and thinking about what might be a manageable amount of radioactive exposure, and I realize this is still a fluid situation. We don't yet know how much radiation is going to be released into the atmosphere. But one of the things that has been discussed is the distribution of iodine tablets to try to protect people from thyroid cancer. Why is that important, and how important is that?
Well, in my view, it's not important at all. It's not actually the appropriate way to deal with the issue of iodine-131. The way radioactive iodine gets into your body is a cloud of iodine falls to the ground. Cows eat grass which has got the radioactive iodine in it. The milk that they produce has radioactive iodine in it, and we drink the milk. So the simple way to avoid the iodine problem is simply not to drink the milk, and that works. Doesn't work with all the other radioisotopes, but for the special case of iodine, simply don't drink the milk.
So that's not like you're using cows and milk production as an example of one way in which all the different ways you can get contaminated. That's the specific route.
It's the specific route for iodine, yeah.
Okay.
So iodine pills, they're not going to do any harm, but they're not really going to do any good either. The real way is to stop people drinking the milk.
We talked a little bit about the prospect of radiation sickness, and again, this is something that we are mostly thinking about for the people who are working inside Fukushima's nuclear plants at this point, trying to stop that. In terms of the symptoms and the prognosis that they are likely to be undergoing, what will authorities be watching for, and what can they do for people who have been significantly exposed? Again, this isn't anything that's certainly going to affect anybody outside of Japan and probably nobody outside those plants themselves.
That's
but
right.
I worry about those people, and I think about them because we're all sort of depending on them getting their jobs done.
Absolutely. I think we can already say that these are heroes who are going into some very dangerous situations. So the first things that one can look for is vomiting. That's one of the very first symptoms of a high radiation exposure. But really, there's a whole panoply of symptoms from just feeling a little bit ill to being seriously ill in the first few hours. Very likely, nobody is going to die, even if they're going to die, within the first few days. It takes several weeks, typically, for people to die of radiation exposure, and again, only for super high radiation doses. And there is a lot that can be done for people who have high radiation exposures. Really, you die from infection. The blood-forming organs, the bone marrow gets damaged, the lining of the gut, the gastrointestinal system gets damaged, and you get infection. So good nursing is absolutely the key. Good nursing, antibiotics, and you can really bring back an awful lot of people who would otherwise die with just fairly simple procedures.
simple, good quality medical care.
Good quality health care.
And to the extent that people might be suffering from those things, there's going to be a small and defined population that does offer them some hope, even the people in the worst case scenarios here.
Yeah, unless people get a super high lethal dose, most of these people will survive, even though they've got very, very high radiation exposures.
And to be clear, if this is freaking you out at home because we're talking about this, you should know that U.S. officials say that they do not expect that any of the releases of radiation thus far are going to pose any threat to any part of the United States, and that what's been released so far is blowing out to sea and is becoming dilute. And so that is the best news for us here as we continue to watch this unfold in Japan. David Brenner, Director for the Center for Radiological Research at Columbia University, thanks for coming and helping.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it. We will get a report live from Japan coming up next.